Number 4. Chapter 4. See people as they are. Social intelligence. Often, the greatest obstacle to our pursuit of mastery comes from the emotional drain we experience in dealing with the Renaissance, resistance, and manipulations of the people around us. If we're not careful, our minds become absorbed in endless political intrigues and battles. The principal problem we face in the social arena is our naive tendency to project onto people our emotional needs and desires of the movement. We misread their intentions and react in ways that cause confusion and conflict. So, social intelligence is the ability to see people in the most realistic light as possible. By moving past our usual self-observation, we can learn to focus deeply on others, reading their behavior in the moment, seeing what motivates them, and discerning any possible manipulative tendencies. Navigating smoothly with social environment, we have more time and energy to focus on learning and acquiring skills. Success attained without this intelligence is not true mastery, and it will not last. Thinking inside. In 1718, Benjamin Franklin, born 1706, died 1790, went to work as an apprentice in his brother James's printing shop in Boston. His dream was to transform himself into a writer. At the printing shop, he would not only be taught how to handle the machines, but also edit manuscripts. Surrounded by books and newspapers, he would have plenty of examples of good writing to study and learn from. It would be perfect position for him. As the apprenticeship progressed, the literary education had imagined for himself came to pass, and his writing skills improved immensely. Then, in 1722, it seemed that he would finally have the perfect opportunity to prove himself as a writer. His brother was about to launch his own large-scale newspaper called the New England Courant. Benjamin approached James with several interesting ideas for stories he could write, but to his great disappointment, his brother was not interested in his contributing to the new paper. This was a serious venture, and Benjamin's work was too immature for the Courant. Benjamin knew it was pointless to argue with James. He was a very stubborn young man. But as he thought about the situation, the idea suddenly came to him. What if he were to create a fictional character, would write letters to the Courant? If he wrote them well enough, James would never suspect that they were from Benjamin, and he would print them. In this way, he would have the last laugh. After much thinking, he decided upon the perfect character to create. A female widow named Silence Dogood, who had lots of strong opinions about life in Boston, many of them rather absurd. To make this believable, Benjamin spent long hours imagining a detailed past for her. He thought so deeply into the character that she began to come alive within him. He could hear her way of thinking, and soon there emerged a very realistic writing voice all her own. He sent the first rather lengthy letter to the Courant and watched with amusement as his brother published it and added the note in the newspaper, asking for more letters from her. James probably suspected it was the work of some established writer in town using a pseudonym. The letter was so witty and satirical, but he clearly had no idea how it was from Benjamin. James continued publishing the subsequent letters, and they quickly became the most popular part of the Courant. Benjamin's responsibilities at the shop began to grow, and he proved to be quite an adept editor for the newspaper as well. Feeling proud of all his precious achievements, one day he could not help himself. He confessed to James he was the author of the Dogwood letters. Expecting some praise for this, he was surprised at James' vitriolic response. His brother did not like being lied to. To make matters worse, over the next few months he turned increasingly cold and even abusive to Benjamin. It soon became impossible to work for him. And by fall of 1723, feeling somewhat desperate, Benjamin decided to flee Boston, turning his back on brother and family. After several weeks of wandering, he ended up in Philadelphia, determined to settle there. He was only 17, with virtually no money and no contacts, but for some reason he felt full of hope. In the 5 years working for his brother, he had learned more about the business than men twice his age. He was fiercely disciplined and ambitious, and he was a talented and successful writer to boot. With no more limitations on his freedom, Philadelphia would be his to conquer. Severing the scene in his first few days there, his confidence only increased. The 2 printing shops in town at the time were well below level of anything in Boston, and the writing in the local papers was abysmal. This meant endless opportunities to fill in a void and make his way. Sure enough, within a few weeks he managed to secure a position at one of the 2 printing shops in town, owned by a man named Samuel Kimir. Philadelphia was still relatively small and provincial at the time. Word spread quickly of a newcomer and his literary skills. The governor of the colony of Pennsylvania, William Keith, had ambitions for transforming Philadelphia into a cultural center, and was not happy with 2 established printing businesses. Hearing of Benjamin Franklin, of his writing talent, he sought him out. Clearly impressed with the young man's intelligence, he urged him to start his own printing shop, promising to lend him the initial amount that he was needed to get the business going. The machines and the materials would have come from London, and Keith advised him to go there personally and supervise the equation. He had contacts there and would bankroll it all. Franklin could hardly believe his good fortune. Only a few months earlier he was a menial apprentice to his brother. Now, thanks to the generous and imprisoning governor, enterprising governor, he would soon have his own printing business, and through he could start a new newspaper and become a leading voice in the city. All before he turned 20. He made his plans for London. The money Keith had promised as a loan was not forthcoming, but after writing it to him a few times, which finally came from the governor's office, not to worry. Letters of credit could be waiting for him once he disembarked in England. And so, without explaining to Kimir what he was up to, he quit his job and bought his passage for the transatlantic journey. When he got to England, there were no letters waiting. Feeling there must have been kind of miscommunication. He frankly looked in London for a representative of the governor to whom he could explain their agreement. In this search, he came upon a wealthy merchant from Philadelphia who, hearing his story, revealed him from the truth. Governor Keith was a notorious talker. He was always promising everything to everyone, trying to impress people with his power. His enthusiasm for a scheme would rarely last than a week. He had no money to lend, and his character was worth about much as his promises. As Franklin took all of this in and considered his current predicament, what disturbed him was not that he found himself in a precarious position, alone and without money, far from home. There was no place more exciting for a young man than London, and he could somehow make his way there. What bothered him was how badly he misread Keith and how naive he had been. Fortunately, London was teeming with large-scale printing shops, and within a few weeks of his arrival, he found a position within one of them. To forget about Keith's fiasco, he threw himself into work, quickly impressing his employer with dexterity, with the various machines, and with his editing skills. He got along well enough with his colleagues, but soon he encountered a strange British custom. 5 times a day, his fellow printers would take a break to drink a pint of beer. It forfeited them for the work, and so, they said, every week Franklin was expected to contribute to the beer fund for those in the room, including himself, but he refused the payout. But he did not like to drink during working hours, and the idea that he should give up a part of his hard-earned wages for others to ruin their health and made him angry. He spoke honestly about his principles, and they politely accepted his decision. Over the ensuing weeks, however, strange things began to happen. Mistakes kept poking up in the text he had already proofread, and almost every day noticed some new error for which he was blamed. He started to feel like he was losing his mind. If this continued or any longer, he would be fired. Clearly, somebody was sabotaging his work. And when he complained to his fellow printers, they attributed it all to a mischievous ghost who was known to haunt the room. Finally figuring out what this meant, he let go of his principles and contributed to the beer fund, the mistake suddenly disappearing along with the ghost. After this incident and several other indiscretions in London, Franklin began to seriously wonder about himself. He seemed hopelessly naive, constantly misreading the intentions of people around him. Thinking about this problem, he was struck by an apparent paradox. When it came to his work, he was supremely rational and realistic, always looking to improve himself. With his writing, for instance, he could see his weaknesses clearly and practiced hard to overcome them. But for people, it was virtually the opposite. He would inevitably become swept up in his emotions and lose all contact with reality. With his brother, he wanted to impress him by revealing his authorship of the letters, totally unaware of the envy and Mavilpose he would unleash. With Keith, he was so wrapped up in his dreams that he paid no attention to obvious signs of what the governor was also with the printers. His anger blinded him to the fact that they would obviously resent his attempts at reform. What was worse, he seemed incapable of changing his self-absorbed dynamic. Determined to break a pattern and change his ways, he decided there only one solution. In all of his future interactions with people, he would force himself to take an initial step forward and not get emotional. From this more detached position, he would focus completely on the people he was dealing with, cutting off his own insecurities and desires from the equation. Exercising his mind this way every time, it would turn into a habit. In imagining how this would work, he had a strange sensation. It reminded him of the process he went through in creating the God letters. Thinking inside the character he had created, entering her world and making her come alive in his mind. For essence, he would be applying this literary skill to everyday life. Gaining position inside people's minds, he could see how to melt their resistance of thwart their malevolent plans. To make this process foolproof, he decided he would also have to adopt a new philosophy: complete and radical acceptance of human nature. People possess indicated qualities and characters. Some are frivolous, like Keith, or vindicative, like his brother, or rigid, like the printers. There are people like this everywhere. It has been that way since the dawn of civilization. To get upset or try to alter them is vital. It will only make them bitter and resentful. Bitter to accept such people as one only accepts the thorns of a rose. Better to observe and accumulate knowledge of human nature as one accumulates knowledge in the sciences. If he could follow his new path in life, he would rid himself of his terrible naivety and bring some rationality to his social relations. After more than a year and a half of work in London, Franklin finally saved enough money for his return journey to the colonies. And in 1727, he found himself back in Philadelphia, looking once more for work. In the midst of his search, his former employer, Samuel Kimir, surprised him by offering Franklin a nice position in the printing shop. He would be in charge of the staff and training others Kimir had recently hired as part of his expanding business. For this, he would receive a nice yearly salary. Franklin accepted, but almost from the beginning he could sense something was not right. And so, as he had promised himself, he took a step back and calmly reviewed the facts. He had 5 men to train, but once he accomplished this task, where would be little work left over for him. Kimir himself had been acting strangely, much friendlier than usual. He was an insecure and prickly gentleman, and his friendly font did not fit him. Imagining the situation from Kimir's perspective, he could sense that he must have greatly resented Franklin's settled departure for London, leaving him in such lurch. He must have seen Franklin as a young whippersnapper who needed his companions. He was not the type to discuss with anyone, but would seethe from within and shame on his own. Thinking in this way, Kimir's intentions became clear to him. He was planning to get Franklin to impart his extensive knowledge of the business to the new employees, then fire him. This would be his revenge. Certain he had read this correctly, he decided to quietly turn the tables. He used his new managerial position to build relationship with customers and to connect with successful merchants of the area. He experimented with some new manufacturing methods that he had learned in England. Then Kimir was away from the shop. He taught himself new skills such as engraving and ink making. He paid close attention to his pupils and carefully cultivated one of them to be a first-rate assistant. And just when he suspected that Kimir was about to fire him, he left and set up his own shop. With financial backing, greater knowledge of the business, a solid base of customers would follow him everywhere as a first-rate assistant whom he had trained. In excluding the strategy, Franklin noticed how free he was from any feelings or bitterness or anger toward Kimir. It was all maneuvers on a chessboard, and by thinking inside Kimir he was able to play the game to perfection with clear and level head. Over the ensuing years, Franklin's printing business prospered. He became a highly successful newspaper publisher, best-selling writer, a scientist renowned for his experiments with electricity, and an inventor of such things as the Franklin stove, and later in life, that of the lightning rod, bifocal glasses, and so on. And an increasingly prominent member of the Philadelphia community. In 1376, he decided it was time to take his career further and enter politics, becoming a delegate to Pennsylvania's colonial legislature. Within a few months, he was chosen unanimously to fellow members to serve as a clerk to the legislature, a position of some influence. But then it was time to review the appointment of a new member of the resistance. Isaac Norris suddenly voiced his vehement opposition, supporting another candidate. After much heated debate, Franklin won the vote, but completing the situation, he saw a danger on the horizon. Norris was a wealthy, well-educated, and charismatic businessman. He was also ambitious and certain to rise within the ranks. If Franklin became antagonistic towards him, he would be expected after what had happened. But the battle over the clerk position, he would confirm any unpleasant notions Norris had entertained of him and convert him into an implacable foe. On the other hand, it was if he ignored him, Norris might read to as an example of Franklin's hawkiness and hate him all the more. To some, it might seem to be the strong and manly thing to go the attack and fight back, proving he was not someone to mess with. But would it not be definitely more powerful to work against Norris's expectations and subtly convert him into an implacable ally? And so Franklin went to work. He observed the man closely in the legislature, gathered information from insiders, and thought himself deeply into Norris's mind. He came into the conclusion that Norris was a proud and somewhat emotional young man who harbored a few insecurities as well. He seemed impatient for attention and being liked and admired by others. Perhaps he envied Franklin's popularity and achievements. Through this insiders, he learned that Norris had one rather odd obsession: an extensive personal library containing many rare books, including one that was particularly rare that he praised above all others. These books seemed to represent him to his own feeling of distraction and nobility. Knowing all of this, Franklin decided upon the following course of action. He wrote to Norris a very polite note, expressing admiration for his collection. He was an avid book lover himself, and hearing so much about that one rare book in Norris's collection, he could be excited beyond belief if he could somehow pursue at his leisure. If Norris would lend this to him, if he could for a few days, he could take great care and return it promptly. Clearly pleased by his attention, Norris sent the book over right away, and Franklin returned it as promised. Norris sent the book right with another note expressing his gratitude for the favor. At the next meeting of legislature, Norris came up to Franklin and engaged him in a friendly conversation, something he had never done before. As he predicted, he had created doubt in Norris's mind instead of his suspicion being confirmed about Franklin. He was not confronted by the fact that the man behaved as a true gentleman, shared interests in rare books, and kept to his word. How could he continue to harbor bad feelings without wondering about himself? Why has he sent the book? Playing on Norris's emotional nature, Franklin shifted his feelings and from antagonism to warmth. They became close friends and then such political allies to the end of their careers. Franklin would go on to practice similar magic on many of his fortunate political foes. In Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin was thought of as the quintessence of the trustworthy merchant and citizen. Like his fellow townsfolk, he dressed plainly. He worked harder than anyone they knew. He never frequented bars or gambling houses, and he had a folksy, even humble manner. His popularity was almost universal, but in the last public chapter of his life, he acted in a way that seemed to indicate and that he had changed and lost common touch. In 1776, a year after the outbreak of the War of Independence, Benjamin Franklin was now a distinguished political figure, dispatched to France as a special commissioner to obtain arms, financing, and alliance. Soon, stories spread throughout the colonies of his various intrigues with French women and account streams of his attendance at lavish parties and dinners, much of which was true. Prominent politicians such as John Adams accused him of, of becoming corrupted with deprivations. His popularity among Americans plummeted, but what the crisis and public did not realize was that whatever he amused by look, the outward morals, and the behavior of the culture at hand, so that he could better make his way. Desperate to win the French over to the American cause and understanding their nature quite well, and he had transformed himself into what they had wanted to see in him, the American version of French period in their way. He was appealing to their notorious narcissism. All of this worked to perfection. Franklin became a beloved figure to the French and a man of influence with their government. In the end, he provoked an important military alliance and gained the kind of financing nobody in his life was an aberration, but the ultimate application of his social rationality.